Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
Camp Scott, a sprawling summer camp nestled deep within the wooded hills of Oklahoma, had always been a sanctuary for children during the heat of the summer. Each year, dozens of campers would flock to the camp, eager for nights spent under the stars, days filled with hiking, swimming, and campfires. In 1977, it was no different, at least on the surface. The camp's entrance, a simple wooden archway, framed the beginning of a long gravel road that led into the heart of the wilderness. Lush trees, thick with leaves, lined the path on either side, casting cool shadows as they swayed gently in the summer breeze. For many of the scouts arriving, it was their first experience of true wilderness. The chirping of birds, the rustling of underbrush, and the faint, distant sounds of laughter from other campers set the mood. Camp Scott promised adventure, friendship, and memories. Yet, beneath the idyllic facade, something lingered. Something darker, hidden among the shadows of the trees and the winding paths of the campgrounds. No one spoke of it, but some of the camp staff had begun to notice things that felt out of place, an unfamiliar silence that would settle over the woods at night, or the occasional flicker of movement just beyond the glow of the campfire. Among the group of campers that year were three best friends: Lori, a shy 9-year-old with blonde pigtails; Michelle, a tomboyish 10-year-old with a love for adventure; and Doris, the youngest of the group, just 8 years old, always eager to prove herself to her older friends. The girls had been counting down the days to camp, thrilled at the thought of spending an entire week in the wild without parents. Their parents had been reluctant at first, but after some convincing by the girls and reassurances from the camp's management, they had relented. The camp had a solid reputation. There had never been any incidents of note, and all the staff were experienced and well-trained. On the first day, the girls arrived with wide smiles, their backpacks filled with the essentials: flashlights, extra socks, and their favorite stuffed animals. They were assigned to Tent 8, one of the furthest tents from the main campgrounds, tucked away near the edge of the forest. Though a little isolated, the girls didn't mind. It felt like their own private corner of the woods, far from the watchful eyes of the counselors and other campers. The sun had just begun to set on that first evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. A large bonfire crackled in the center of the camp, where all the scouts and counselors had gathered for the opening ceremony. Marshmallows were roasted, songs were sung, and stories were told, some funny, others spooky, in the spirit of campfire tradition. Lori, Michelle, and Doris huddled together on a log, laughing and whispering amongst themselves. Michelle, ever the brave one, was eager for the stories to get scarier. "Tell us about the ghosts," she urged one of the older counselors, earning giggles from the other campers. The counselor obliged, spinning a tale of an old hermit who supposedly roamed the woods around the camp, searching for his lost daughter. The story sent shivers down the spines of some of the younger scouts, but Michelle loved it. After the bonfire, The girls made their way back to Tent 8. The path was dark, the only light coming from their flashlights as they swung them back and forth playfully. The thick canopy of trees above blocked out most of the moonlight, casting deep shadows along the trail. As they walked, they spoke in hushed voices about the ghost stories they'd heard, their imaginations running wild. The forest seemed to close in around them, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig causing them to jump. But it was all in good fun, or so they thought. When they reached their tent, they climbed inside and zipped up the entrance, their giggles subsiding as exhaustion set in. The night air was cooler now, a welcome relief from the day's heat. Lori crawled into her sleeping bag first, clutching her flashlight, while Michelle and Doris followed suit. The soft chirping of crickets filled the air, along with the occasional hoot of an owl. The forest was alive, but in the comforting way that nature always was. Still, there was something off. Lori felt it first, a sensation that she couldn't quite explain. It was as though the usual nighttime sounds of the forest had changed. The crickets had gone silent, and the rustling of the wind through the trees seemed closer, more deliberate. She told herself it was just her imagination, the result of too many ghost stories before bed. But as she closed her eyes, that creeping unease refused to leave. Earlier that day, while helping the camper settle in, one of the counselors had come across something strange. As she was unpacking supplies in the main cabin, she found a crumpled piece of paper wedged between some boxes. The note was hastily written in messy handwriting, its contents chilling. "I'm going to kill 3 campers tonight." The counselor, Janice, initially thought it was a sick joke. After all, pranks weren't uncommon at Camp Scott, and with so many kids telling spooky stories, someone could easily have left the note as part of a scare tactic. She considered reporting it to the camp director, but in the chaos of the first day, it slipped her mind. She shoved the note into her pocket and carried on with her duties, not giving it another thought. But as night fell and the campers headed back to their tents, Janice felt a gnawing sense of guilt. What if the note wasn't a joke? She dismissed the thought again. "It's just a prank," she told herself. "No one would actually do something like that." Still, the unease lingered. Back in Tent 8, Lori's eyes fluttered open as a faint sound reached her ears. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling outside the tent. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced over at Michelle and Doris, both fast asleep in their sleeping bags. The sound came again, this time closer, more distinct. Was it just an animal? She held her breath, straining to listen, but the night was now silent. Too silent. Lori's grip on her flashlight tightened as she lay there, her body tense. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind, just the trees swaying in the night. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere around them had changed. Suddenly, there was a soft thud against the side of the tent. Lori's heart raced, and she sat up quickly, her eyes wide in the darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hand shaking, and clicked it on, illuminating the inside of the tent. Nothing seemed out of place. Michelle and Doris were still sound asleep. She wanted to wake them, to tell them what she'd heard, but she didn't want to scare them. Maybe it was just a branch falling, or maybe some of the other campers playing a prank. That had to be it. But then she heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves outside the tent. Lori's breath hitched. and she instinctively pulled her sleeping bag up to her chin, as though it could protect her from whatever, or whoever, was out there. The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a shadow fell across the fabric of the tent, barely visible in the moonlight. Someone was standing just outside. The next morning, the soft light of dawn filtered through the thin canvas of the tent, casting a gentle glow over the three sleeping girls. Outside, the camp slowly stirred to life. The distant sounds of birds chirping and counselors preparing breakfast echoing through the woods. Lori was the first to wake. She blinked groggily, her mind still clouded by the remnants of a restless night. Her body felt heavy, as if weighed down by the unease that had settled over her the night before. For a moment, she lay there, listening to the steady breathing of Michelle and Doris beside her, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had gripped her during the night. She glanced around the tent, half expecting to see some sign of the strange noises she'd heard. Footprints, a broken branch, anything, but there was nothing. Everything looked exactly as it had when they'd gone to sleep. The eerie rustling, the shadow outside the tent, the feeling of being watched, it all felt distant now, like a half-remembered dream. Lori told herself she'd just imagined it, but something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. Michelle woke next, stretching and yawning loudly. "What time is it?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. She didn't seem to notice Lori's tension, too caught up in the excitement of the new day. Doris followed suit, her small frame still wrapped tightly in her sleeping bag, grumbling about how cold it was. Lori forced a smile. She didn't want to worry her friends. "It's early," she said, glancing at her watch. "We should probably get ready for breakfast." As the girls gathered their things and prepared to leave the tent, Lori hesitated. She felt a sudden urge to check outside, to make sure there really was nothing out there. Without saying anything, she unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, the fresh morning air hitting her face. The ground was damp with dew, and the trees cast long shadows across the clearing where their tent sat. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of the mysterious footsteps or the shadow from the night before. Lori scanned the area, her heart pounding in her chest, but all she saw were the other tents and the distant smoke from the campfire where breakfast was being prepared. Maybe it had all been in her head, but just as she turned to go back inside the tent, something caught her eye. About 10 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, was a small, red object lying in the grass. Lori frowned and took a few cautious steps toward it, her stomach twisting with unease. It was a flashlight. A red flashlight, old and worn, with scratches along the side. Lori stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if it belonged to anyone in their group. It didn't look familiar, and none of the girls had red flashlights. She bent down and picked it up, feeling the cold metal in her hand. That's when she noticed the blood. It was faint, just a few smudges near the base of the flashlight, but it was unmistakable. Lori's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly dropped the flashlight as if it had burned her. She backed away, her mind racing. Blood? Here? How could that be? "Lori! Come on! We're gonna be late!" Michelle's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see her friends waiting impatiently by the tent, oblivious to what she had just found. Lori swallowed hard and forced herself to move. She didn't say anything about the flashlight. Not yet. She didn't want to scare them, not without knowing more. But as they walked toward the main camp area for breakfast, Lori couldn't shake the growing feeling of dread in her chest. Something was wrong. Very wrong. At breakfast, the atmosphere was light and cheerful, the scent of pancakes and bacon filling the air as the campers gathered around the picnic tables. The chatter of excited children echoed through the clearing, and the counselors moved about, serving food and making sure everything was running smoothly. Lori, Michelle, and Doris sat together, their plates piled high with food, but Lori barely touched hers. She kept glancing around, scanning the faces of the other campers and counselors, looking for any sign that someone else had seen what she had seen. But everyone seemed perfectly normal, happy even, laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. Lori's thoughts drifted back to the note the counselor had found, the one promising to kill 3 campers. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even Michelle or Doris. The counselor, Janice, had insisted it was just a prank, a sick joke left by one of the older campers trying to scare the younger ones. But now, with the strange sounds outside the tent and the bloody flashlight, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. Halfway through breakfast, Lori noticed 2 of the counselors, Janice and Mark, standing off to the side, talking in hushed tones. Janice's face was pale, her brow furrowed with concern. She glanced around nervously as she spoke, her eyes scanning the camp in a way that made Lori's stomach twist. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Something was wrong, and the counselors knew it too. Lori nudged Michelle. "Look," she whispered, nodding toward the counselors. Michelle followed her gaze and frowned. "What's going on?" They look worried. "I don't know," Lori said softly, "but I think something's wrong." Before Michelle could respond, Janice suddenly raised her voice, calling for the campers' attention. "All right, everyone," she said, trying to sound cheerful, though her voice trembled slightly. "After breakfast, we'll be splitting into groups for our activities today. Make sure you stay with your group at all times, okay? We don't want anyone wandering off on their own." The campers nodded, not thinking much of the warning, but Lori couldn't shake the feeling that Janice's words were meant for more than just keeping kids from getting lost in the woods. As the morning wore on, the campers were divided into groups and sent off to their respective activities. Lori, Michelle, and Doris were assigned to a hiking group led by one of the younger counselors, a cheerful woman named Emily. They set off into the woods, their excitement renewed as they followed the winding trails deeper into the forest. Lori tried to focus on the hike, but her mind kept drifting back to the flashlight. She hadn't told anyone yet, but it weighed heavily on her. What if it was connected to the note? What if someone really was out there watching them? The thought made her skin crawl. As they walked, Lori lagged behind the group, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The woods were thick and overgrown, the underbrush rustling softly in the breeze. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of something, a shadow, a flicker of movement, but when she looked closer, it was gone. Michelle noticed her distraction and slowed her pace to match Lori's. "What's up with you?" she asked, nudging her playfully. "You've been acting weird all morning." Lori hesitated. She didn't want to scare her friend, but she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. I found something this morning," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lori glanced around to make sure no one else was listening before continuing. "When I went outside the tent this morning, I found a flashlight. A red one. And it had blood on it." Michelle's eyes widened. "What? Are you serious?" Lori nodded, her heart racing. "I don't know what it means, but something's not right. I think it might be connected to that note Janice found. Michelle's face paled as she processed the information. Lori, that's really freaky. Do you think someone's messing with us? I don't know, Lori admitted, but I have a bad feeling about this. Maybe we should tell someone. Michelle bit her lip, clearly torn. On one hand, she didn't want to cause a panic. But on the other hand, if Lori was right, they couldn't just ignore it. Okay, she said finally. After the hike, we'll talk to Janice. She needs to know. The hike continued, the group winding their way through the dense forest. The trail grew narrower as they ventured deeper into the woods, the trees looming overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the stillness. At one point, the group paused to take a break near a small clearing. Lori and Michelle sat together on a fallen log, their conversation from earlier still heavy in the air between them. Doris, oblivious to the tension, busied herself with collecting rocks and sticks, chatting happily with the other campers. Lori's unease had only grown stronger as they ventured deeper into the woods. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing. By the time the campers returned from their hike, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The warmth of the day had faded, replaced by a chill that crept through the air like an uninvited guest. Lori, Michelle, and Doris were quiet as they made their way back to the main camp area, the excitement of the morning replaced by a heavy sense of unease. The counselors had noticed the change in the girls. Janice, in particular, seemed on edge, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped frown. She kept a close eye on the campers, her gaze lingering on the tree line as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the woods at any moment. Lori couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry with it a sense of menace, as if the forest itself was hiding something dark and terrible. She kept her head down, trying to focus on the ground beneath her feet, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the flashlight she had found that morning. She still hadn't told anyone, not even Janice. She wanted to, but something was holding her back, something she couldn't quite explain. It was as if by speaking the words out loud, she would somehow make the danger real. And the truth was, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face that reality. Michelle, sensing her friend's unease, tried to lighten the mood. Hey, she said, nudging Lori's arm. You okay? You've been pretty quiet all day. Lori forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. Michelle didn't press her, but the look on her face made it clear she wasn't convinced. Doris, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the tension, happily skipping ahead of them, her backpack bouncing with each step. As they reached the main camp area, the smell of dinner cooking over the campfire filled the air, and the other campers gathered around, eager for their evening meal. Lori, Michelle, and Doris joined the group, though Lori's appetite had all but disappeared. She picked at her food, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange noises, the flashlight, and the bloody footprint. Janice made her way over to their table, her expression tight with worry. How was the hike, girls? She asked, trying to sound cheerful but failing miserably. It was fine, Michelle said quickly, glancing at Lori. A little spooky, though. The woods are really quiet. Janice nodded, her eyes darting toward the forest. Yeah, they can be like that sometimes. But don't worry, we're all safe here. Lori wasn't so sure. That night, after the campers had settled into their tents, Lori found herself lying awake, staring at the canvas above her head. The sound of crickets filled the air, their rhythmic chirping oddly soothing, but Lori couldn't relax. Her mind was still buzzing with the events of the day. Michelle and Doris were already asleep, their soft breathing the only other sound in the tent. Lori rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but no matter how much she shifted, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The flashlight, the blood. Her thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the clearing when she had picked up the flashlight and seen the smudges of blood on its surface. She hadn't told anyone about it yet, not even Michelle. She didn't want to scare her friends, but she couldn't keep it to herself forever. With a sigh, Lori sat up and reached for her flashlight, turning it on and casting a soft beam of light around the tent. Everything seemed normal, just their sleeping bags, backpacks, and the faint outlines of her friends' bodies beneath the covers. But then she heard it, a soft rustling sound, like someone, or something, moving just outside the tent. Lori froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned off her flashlight and held her breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time louder, as if it were right outside the tent flap. Lori's mind raced. Could it be an animal? Or was it something else? Slowly, carefully, she reached over and shook Michelle awake. "Michelle," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wake up!" Michelle stirred, blinking groggily. "What? What is it?" "Listen," Lori whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" Michelle sat up, rubbing her eyes. At first, she didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but then the sound came again, this time unmistakable. A rustling, followed by a low, almost inaudible murmur, like someone whispering just outside the tent. Michelle's eyes widened in fear. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Lori replied, her heart racing. "But we need to be quiet." For several long minutes, they sat in silence, listening to the strange noises outside. It wasn't until the sounds faded away, disappearing into the night, that they dared to breathe again. Lori glanced at the tent flap, her mind racing. Should they go outside and check? Or should they stay put and hope that whatever, or whoever, was out there would leave them alone? Before they could decide, the tent flap suddenly shifted, as if something had brushed against it from the outside. Both girls gasped, their eyes wide with terror. But just as quickly as it had happened, the tent flap stilled, and the night fell silent once more. The next morning, Lori felt as though she hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but her mind was still buzzing with the memory of the strange sounds from the night before. Michelle was quiet, too, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a tense silence. Doris, however, seemed completely unfazed by the events of the night. She chattered happily as they made their way to breakfast, oblivious to the worry etched across Lori and Michelle's faces. At breakfast, Lori kept glancing at Janice, wondering if she should say something. The counselor still looked on edge, her eyes scanning the camp nervously, but she didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. As they sat down to eat, Lori leaned over to Michelle. "We should tell her," she whispered, "about the sounds last night." Michelle nodded, though she looked uncertain. "Yeah, maybe. But what if it was just an animal? We don't want to scare everyone for no reason." Lori hesitated. Michelle had a point. but something about the noises had felt off. Not like an animal, but like something else. Something more deliberate. Before they could discuss it further, Janice approached their table, her face tense with concern. "How are you girls doing this morning?" she asked, her voice tight. Lori hesitated, glancing at Michelle before responding. "We're okay, I guess. But something weird happened last night." Janice's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We heard something," Michelle said, her voice low. "Outside our tent. Like rustling and whispering." Janice's face paled. "Whispering?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. Lori nodded. "Yeah. It sounded like someone was right outside our tent." For a moment, Janice didn't say anything. She just stood there, her face growing paler by the second. Then, without another word, she turned and hurried away, leaving the girls staring after her in confusion. Later that morning, Lori, Michelle, and Doris were assigned to help clean up the campfire area while the other campers went on a nature walk. It was a relatively simple task, picking up trash, organizing supplies, but Lori couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they worked, Lori's mind kept drifting back to the sounds from the night before. She glanced at Michelle, who was equally distracted, and then over at Doris, who seemed blissfully unaware of the tension hanging in the air. They were just about finished when Lori noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, was caught on a low-hanging branch. It was small, about the size of a handkerchief, and it looked out of place among the otherwise tidy camp. Lori frowned and walked over to it, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers brushing against something sticky. Blood. Lori gasped and pulled her hand back, staring at the fabric in horror. There was blood on it, just like there had been on the flashlight. "Michelle," she called, her voice trembling. "Come look at this." Michelle hurried over, her eyes widening as she saw the blood-stained fabric. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Lori, what is that?" "I don't know," Lori replied, her voice shaking. "But we need to tell someone. Now!" Before they could move, a shadow fell over them, and they looked up to see Janice standing behind them, her face pale, and her eyes wide with fear. "Girls," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to come with me. Right now." Janice's face, pale and tense, betrayed her emotions even before she spoke. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Lori and Michelle. Doris, usually upbeat, now stood frozen, sensing the urgency in the air. "Follow me," Janice said, her voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. Lori and Michelle exchanged nervous glances, quickly gathering their belongings. Doris hesitated, casting confused looks toward the forest, but Janice's tone had left no room for objections. Together, the girls followed her back toward the counselor's cabin, a small structure nestled on the outskirts of the camp. Janice led them through the trees with hurried steps, constantly checking over her shoulder, her paranoia palpable. The forest, now darkening with the onset of twilight, felt like it was closing in on them. The sounds of birds and insects faded, leaving only the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. "What's going on, Janice?" Lori finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Janice stopped suddenly, turning to face the girls. Her face was drawn, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to explain this," she began, her voice trembling, "but something's not right here. There's something, someone, out there, and I'm afraid they're watching us. Michelle gasped softly. What do you mean? Did you see something? Janice swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the darkening forest. It's not just what I've seen. It's what I've heard. Strange noises at night. Footprints in places no one should be walking. And now, she glanced down at the bloody cloth Lori had found earlier. A chill crept down Lori's spine. She could feel the weight of the forest around them, pressing in from all sides. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. Janice took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. We're not safe here, she whispered, her voice low and urgent. Something is wrong, and I'm not waiting to find out what. By the time they reached the camp, the sun had disappeared behind the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The other campers were gathered around the fire pit, their faces lit by the flickering flames, but the usual chatter and laughter were missing. An uneasy silence hung in the air. Janice gestured for the girls to follow her to the cabin, where the other counselors had gathered. Lori's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the small wooden building, its windows dark and foreboding. She had never seen Janice this rattled before, and it only fueled her growing sense of dread. Inside the cabin, the other counselors, David, Claire, and Thomas, stood around a table, their faces grim. They looked up as Janice entered, and Lori could see the fear in their eyes. What's going on? David asked, his voice tight with concern. Janice placed the blood-stained cloth on the table, her hand trembling. We found this in the woods, she said softly, and the girls heard something outside their tent last night. Whispering. Thomas frowned, his jaw clenched. Whispering? Are you sure? Lori nodded, her heart racing. We heard it. It was right outside our tent. David ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. This is getting out of hand. First the missing camper, now this. We need to call the authorities. Janice shook her head. We don't even know what's going on. What if it's just some prank? Claire, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. Prank or not, we can't ignore the signs. Something is happening out there, and we need to keep these kids safe. There was a heavy silence as the counselors exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Janice sighed. All right, we'll make the call. But in the meantime, we need to stay vigilant. No one goes anywhere alone. As the counselors debated their next steps, a storm began to brew on the horizon. Dark clouds rolled in, covering the sky in a thick, oppressive blanket. The air grew heavy with moisture, and the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly on the roof of the cabin. Lori stood by the window, watching the storm approach with a growing sense of unease. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees and bending their branches. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the darkened forest for a brief moment before plunging it back into darkness. This storm is going to make things worse, Michelle muttered, standing beside Lori. If something or someone is out there, they'll use the storm as cover. Lori nodded, her eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. But the forest remained still, save for the swaying of the trees in the wind. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof with a steady rhythm. Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. The counselors had stopped their discussion and were now preparing for the worst, gathering flashlights and radios in case of an emergency. Janice approached Lori and Michelle, her face drawn with worry. You two need to stay in the main camp area with the others. Don't wander off, and if anything happens, you come straight to us. Understand?" Lori nodded, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the reality of the danger they were in sinking in. As they left the cabin and made their way back to the fire pit, the storm intensified. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the wind howled through the trees. The other campers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "Is everything okay?" Doris asked, her voice trembling. Lori forced a smile, trying to hide her own fear. "Yeah, everything's fine. We just need to stick together." But deep down, she knew that nothing was fine. Something was out there in the darkness, and the storm was only making it harder to see. As the night wore on, the storm grew more violent. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the camp in brief flashes of blinding light. The rain poured down in sheets, soaking everything and everyone. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the campers huddled under the tarp, their bodies trembling from the cold and fear. Lori sat with her back against a tree, her eyes scanning the darkened forest. She could barely see more than a few feet in front of her, but she kept her flashlight off, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Beside her, Michelle was silent, her eyes wide with terror. Doris had fallen asleep, her head resting on her backpack, but Lori knew it wouldn't be long before the storm woke her. The counselors had positioned themselves around the camp, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they patrolled the perimeter. But Lori knew that if something, or someone, was out there, the storm would make it almost impossible to see them coming. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire camp. For a brief moment, Lori thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned to Michelle. "Did you see that?" Michelle shook her head, her face pale. "See what?" Lori hesitated, glancing back at the spot where she had seen the figure. But it was gone now, swallowed by the darkness. "Nothing," she muttered, her heart pounding. "It's probably just the storm playing tricks on me." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The storm raged overhead, the wind howling through the trees like a mournful cry. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to move, and Lori's mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking out there in the dark. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds that the storm finally began to subside. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the wind died down, leaving the camp in an eerie silence. But the sense of unease remained. As the campers began to stir, the counselors gathered to take a head count. But as they moved through the group, panic began to spread. One of the campers was missing. "Doris!" Lori cried, her heart racing as she looked around frantically. "Where's Doris?" Michelle's face went pale. "She was right here. She was asleep next to me all night." The counselors immediately sprang into action, organizing a search party to comb through the camp and the surrounding woods. But as the minutes turned into hours, there was still no sign of Doris. Lori's heart ached with guilt. She had been right next to her all night, and yet somehow Doris had disappeared without a trace. "What's happening?" Michelle whispered, her voice trembling. "How could she just vanish?" Lori shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. "But we need to find her, before it's too late." The search party spread out through the woods, their voices echoing through the trees as they called Doris's name. Panic and fear gripped the camp as time dragged on with no sign of her. The counselors' faces were pale, their attempts to remain calm failing. Every passing hour made the situation more desperate. Lori, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent the entire night next to Doris, yet somehow her friend had vanished in the dead of night, leaving no trace behind. Guilt weighed heavily on her, and her mind raced with possibilities. Was Doris still out there, hiding somewhere? Or had something terrible happened? David, one of the counselors, organized small groups to search different parts of the woods, each group equipped with flashlights and radios. As the hours passed, the campers began to whisper amongst themselves, fear spreading like wildfire. The forest, once a place of adventure and fun, now felt ominous and threatening. Lori, Michelle, and Janice remained together, moving cautiously through the underbrush, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made Lori jump. The storm had left the forest drenched, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. It felt as though the woods were closing in around them, suffocating in their intensity. "We'll find her," Janice said softly, though Lori could hear the doubt in her voice. But deep down, Lori wasn't so sure. It wasn't until late afternoon that a shout rang out from one of the search teams. Lori's heart skipped a beat, and she and Michelle hurried toward the source of the noise. When they arrived, they found David and Claire standing by the edge of a small ravine, their faces pale and drawn. Lori's stomach churned as she looked down into the ravine. There, half hidden beneath the underbrush, lay a shoe. It was unmistakably Doris's. "Oh my God," Michelle whispered, her voice barely audible. David radioed the other teams, and within minutes, the counselors were gathered at the edge of the ravine. They descended cautiously, carefully making their way down the steep slope to where the shoe had been found. As they searched the area, it quickly became apparent that something had gone terribly wrong. There were signs of a struggle, broken branches, disturbed earth, but no sign of Doris herself. Lori's mind raced. Had Doris fallen into the ravine? Had someone taken her? The possibilities were endless, each more terrifying than the last. The counselors radioed for help, their voices tense and urgent. The situation had escalated beyond their control, and now it was clear they needed professional assistance. But for Lori, it felt like they were running out of time. As night fell once again, the camp was plunged into a state of high alert. The local authorities had arrived, setting up a perimeter around the camp and combing through the woods with searchlights and trained dogs. But despite their best efforts, there was still no sign of Doris. Lori sat by the fire pit, staring into the flames, her mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. The forest, now completely dark, seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. Michelle sat beside her, silent and pale, her eyes hollow with fear. Janice paced back and forth, her hands clenched into fists, clearly frustrated by the lack of progress. "We're going to find her," Janice said for the 100th time, though her voice lacked conviction. Lori glanced toward the edge of the woods, her stomach twisting into knots. "What if we don't?" Before Janice could answer, there was a sudden commotion near the counselor's cabin. Lori stood up, her heart pounding, as one of the officers approached, his face grim. "We've found something," he said, his voice low. but you need to stay here. The next morning brought a chilling revelation. The authorities had discovered more than just Doris's shoe. Hidden deep in the woods, not far from the ravine, they found an old, abandoned cabin, one that had been forgotten by the camp staff for years. Inside, they discovered evidence that shook the camp to its core. The cabin was filled with makeshift bedding, old supplies, and most disturbingly, photographs. Photographs of the campers, the counselors, even the cabins themselves. It was clear that someone had been watching them for a long time, stalking them from the shadows. The realization hit Lori like a punch to the gut. Whoever had taken Doris had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The whispers in the night, the strange noises, the footprints, it had all been leading to this. But there was still no sign of Doris herself. As the investigation intensified, the authorities uncovered a disturbing connection. The cabin belonged to a former employee of the camp, a man who had been dismissed years ago under mysterious circumstances. His name was Roger, and though he had disappeared after his dismissal, it seemed he had never really left. The more they learned about Roger, the more horrifying the truth became. He had been living in the woods, watching the camp from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the question remained, where was Doris? It wasn't until the third day of the search that Lori found herself back at the edge of the ravine, staring down into the depths of the forest below. Something had been nagging at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She knew she had to go back. Against the advice of the authorities, Lori, Michelle, and Janice returned to the ravine, their flashlights cutting through the early morning mist. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. As they descended into the ravine, Lori's heart raced. Her mind replayed the events of the past few days over and over, searching for answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that Doris was still out there, waiting to be found. And then they saw it. At the base of a large tree, half hidden by the underbrush, was a trapdoor. It was old and rusted, almost completely camouflaged by the forest floor. Lori's breath caught in her throat as she knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow, dirt-covered tunnel that descended into darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up from below, making Lori's stomach churn. Without a word, the three girls descended into the tunnel, their flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. The air was thick and heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper underground. The tunnel led to a small, underground chamber. And there, in the corner, huddled and shivering, was Doris. Doris was alive, but barely. She had been trapped in the underground chamber for days, with no food or water. Her captor, Roger, had left her there to die, but somehow she had survived. The authorities quickly moved in, arresting Roger and bringing Doris to safety. The camp was shut down, and the investigation into Roger's crimes began. The full extent of his actions was still unclear, but one thing was certain. He had been watching them for years, planning his twisted revenge on the camp that had once rejected him. For Lori, Michelle, and Janice, the ordeal was far from over. The trauma of what they had experienced would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of the horrors that had lurked in the shadows of the camp. But they had survived. And in the end, that was all that mattered.